presentation is Listening to the Other, on the theory versus research debate in psychoanalysis. Dr. Mills is a philosopher, a psychoanalyst, and clinical psychologist. He is professor of psychology and psychoanalysis at the Adler Graduate Professional School in Toronto and runs a mental health corporation in Ontario, Canada. He is the recipient of numerous awards for his scholarship, including 4 Gradiva Awards. He is the author and/or editor of 22 books in psychoanalysis, philosophy, psychology, and cultural studies. Dr. Mills.
It's an honor to be on the panel. It's an honor to meet Bob Bornstein for the first time, because several years ago we had an exchange, and I stand corrected that Bob has predicted the impending death of psychoanalysis. But we hope to rectify that with further research and scholarship. The rivalry between psychoanalytic practitioners and researchers, often academics, are well known, as each often thinks of the other as elitist, recalcitrant, or simply irrelevant. But we do not need to perpetuate a bifurcation between research and practice in order to appreciate a common assumption that theory grounds clinical praxis, scholarship, and research methodology. In an attempt to broach a common ground, let me suggest that the theoretician, practitioner, and researcher are all engaged in modes of investigation. They differ only in methodology. Let us call this common ground a theory of discourse. Just as there are different discourses on method, there are also different different methods of discourse. But regardless of these differences, they share a common logos, namely a rational ground. When Heidegger discusses the concepts of logos and truth as disclosedness or unconcealment, he tells us that discourse as logos, quote, lets something be seen, end quote, by making it manifest and accessible to another party. Theoretical engagement and the empirical method both employ their own modes of discourse as logos in an effort to let something be seen, whether in appearance or reality, as phenomenal description or demonstrated fact, with the stipulation that some discourses are more persuasive than others. What I'm particularly interested in addressing here are not specific theories of psychoanalysis or specific research finding themselves, but rather what constitutes a good theory that would apply to all psychoanalytic discourses. A particular approach to theorizing, speculative, logical, empirical, already imports certain epistemological assumptions about the very nature of the discourse itself, such as what the theory is supposed to do, or be used for, or what it's about, or accounts for, or signifies, what's supposed to describe, and so on. For this reason, any theoretical, practical, or research paradigm introduces explicit presuppositions about the way things are and their very approach to such investigations, and hence engage answers to fundamental questions such as, what is the origin, function, subject matter, feature, or referent, and reason or meaning of what we are investigating. So what we are really talking about is a theory on discourse, not on discourse itself. If theory and research are always about something, then they import ontology, namely the material world, human phenomenon, culture, anthropology, even cosmogony, and so on, despite the sociological and psychological functions they serve. So first of all, investigation of any kind is about ontology, what is purportedly real, even if only symbolic or bears out to be a false claim. Now, the function of discourse is varied, sociologically diverse, and ultimately idiosyncratic to individual persons despite participating in common collective beliefs and practices. Functions of theory or research may be designed to discover facts and impart knowledge, such as in science, bind social collectives, such as in culture and religion, facilitate roles and rituals, or have applied personal purposes and delineations. But they often serve a job or a task, such as a utilitarian description, interpretation, observation, deliberation, way of being, explanation, and/or expression of human phenomena, even when the subject matter is not about the human being. In this way, discourse is about utility, service, helpfulness, and efficacy. The meaning of discourse can be literal, figurative, metaphorical, symbolic, semiotically circumscribed, such as in a creed or a doctrine or ideology, and imaginative, which is always open to hermeneutics and fantasy. In this way, logos can be personal and collective, hence universal, regardless of the form and content, and open to an infinite chain of significations, meaning relations, and reference without being predetermined or confined in its ostensive definition or purpose. In this way, both function and meaning may be interdependent within a rubric of irreducibility. Critique of discourse is often not discussed in the behavioral sciences. A theory is merely presumed according to discipline-specific norms. The same applies to studies of logos and theories about theoretics that are taken at face value rather than critiqued for their disposition, structure, methodology, epistemological verity, and viability as an explanatory model of knowledge. Rather than critique the value and limits of psychoanalytic research, we may see how sound theory is a necessary requirement that guides research methodology. In general, psychoanalytic theory should be descriptive, coherent, expository, generalizable, meaningful, and pragmatic, namely useful. To what degree is theory and method arbitrary, contextual, contingent, relative, personalized, exploratory, hence experimental, and non-conclusive? Does theory only provide parameters for explanation and meaning, or does it guide method? If so, are theory and method necessarily the same thing? And if so, how do they stand in relation to individual and cultural differences, social and anthropological discrepancies, historical and gender variances? How does this stand in relation to clinical process? And can a method, in theory, transpire without relying on theory? In other words, can a methodology actually be executed devoid of any theoretic directing the method or procedural actions themselves? No, it cannot. For method is predicated on a set of philosophical assumptions it presupposes inductively or abductively, even when testing a hypothesis. Every discipline has a set of theoretical orienting principles guiding inquiry, research, and methodological process, whether presumptive or not. Is this notion of criteria any different for the psychoanalytic clinician or researcher? It is here that I hope to explore possible points of consilience between researchers, clinicians, and scholars who gain through mutual recognition by listening to the voice of the other. It was Dilthey who proposed the distinction between the human sciences based upon investigating and understanding the motivations and meanings inherent to the experiential subject or human being versus that of the natural sciences, which is concerned with the impersonal forces and organizations of nature, whereas the Geisteswissenschaften focus on the science of the mental processes and social systems within a class of human events, the Natavastan focus on the domain of the natural world. Therefore, the bifurcation that is often forged between the human and natural sciences takes as its premise that nature and human experience are mutually exclusive categories. However, the distinction lies in the methodology and disclosure about each discipline employs. But regardless of which approach we adopt, we cannot evade making ontological assertions. To say that a hermeneutic, semiotic, or scientific paradigm describes or explains a phenomenon, even if mired in uncertainty and impasse, is to evoke a referent that is still about something. The mode of discourse does not displace the signified objects in question. We cannot elude the question of truth and realism no matter what discourse we adopt. In other words, metaphysics always has a way of coming back to bite us in the ass. This brings us to ask, does logos have to meet the challenge of science? At face value, yes, but with stipulations. Science attempts to explain while discourse may serve many functions, science cannot. But this all depends upon what we mean by science. Hence, to know, from the Latin scientia, from scire, to understand. In the social sciences, psychoanalysis for instance, to offer a theory that explains psychological conditions and states of mind within social collectives, discourse attempts to present the complexity of intrapsychic, intersubjective, and communal arrangements within a given culture, an unconscious manifestation of the need to make the unconscious conscious. For psychoanalysis, discourse reveals in disguised forms all of humanity's desires, conflicts, defenses, emotions, traits, dispositions, longings, and complexes that expose the personal and collective plight of humankind. Here, logos, as word, as paradigmatic model, has psychological significance for masses and functions in psychic economy unconsciously. In this way, discourse as functionalism serves the overdetermined systems of meaning in society and provides regulation to constant change, such as there is order, purpose, and structure to socio-cultural networks via the narrative. A narrative, in turn, provides meaning, which is at once open to interpretation, even when attempts at explanation fail. Yet the notion of explanation is itself controversial. An explanandum describes a phenomenon to be explained, not the phenomenon itself, while an explanans seeks to adduce an answer or explanation to account for the phenomenon, its reasons, purpose, origins, and so forth. While the explicandum is that which gets explicated, the explicans is that which gives the explication. Although an explanation attempts to account for the coming into being of a phenomenon, it is more than that. It always implies, if not literally evokes, the question of causality by attempting to explain the ground or preconditions that bring something about, such as a certain antecedent events or the necessary conditions, not sufficient ones, that are temporarily and materially a priori. So contrary to predicate or propositional logic, which is merely concerned with the meaning of words or expressions and their formal systemic relations and operations, or statements that make something comprehensible, an explanans is much more far-reaching. It is about ontology. On the one hand, an interpretation is an attempt to describe phenomenon. On the other, an explanation attempts to offer more. That is, how and why phenomenon occurs. But so does an interpretation. Each are about explication. So how does an interpretation differ from an explanation? When applied to the question of discourse, I argue that both interpretive and explanatory models are equally making ontological claims, hence the research paradigm we just saw and the hermeneutic clinical paradigm. Even if they are tarrying in epistemic uncertainty when it comes to the question of causality. Recall that for the ancients, a cause was the reason or explanation for something happening, which is always overdetermined. If psychoanalytic theory or science, hence empirical research, is a declarative attempt to make phenomena comprehensible, then we must contend that it's offering an explanation of phenomenon, even if contestable, or it would not have any currency to grant meaning to the human mind. Whether it is true or false is another issue, one we could adjourn for now. In the end, modes of discourse offer narratives that signify, describe, and explain phenomenon. But why should we grant the narrative, the story, the status of offering a theory of causality? Why should we assume an explanans has any more epistemological weight or verity to phenomenal description, an explanandum? Does not an explanation have multiple threads, multiple significations, hence an overdetermination and surplus of meaning and value, not to mention causal semiotic strands of deferral to an infinite chain of associations and signifiers? This logically implies that no single explanation is ever complete or unequivocally valid, rather only a partial attempt at conceptualizing and describing phenomenon. Since the Western epistemological turn in modernity and the hermeneutical narrative turn in more contemporary postmodern times, we may concede that our understanding and consensus of the meaning of truth remains hotly contested. If interpretive and explanatory models are used to describe and lend understanding to phenomenon, which always evoke, again, the question of being, as I argue, then they inevitably engage the questions of truth and epistemology, even if unintended or silent on the matter. But what does this imply? This would suggest that any discourse on discourse simultaneously speaks about epistemic verity and or truth or falsity in its predications or claims. But what do we mean by truth? If logos cannot elude the question of truth, then would not any discourse on truth equally imply that a certain mythology is at play? The myth that there is truth, as if it were a single unified condition, entity, or unquestionable empirical state of affairs that transcends all phenomenal realities and fulfills every epistemic criterion imaginable, is simply a fantasy. If this were otherwise, then no one would be debating the question's scope and meaning of truth. It would simply be accepted as given, as part of our natural thrownness. As I've critiqued elsewhere, a discourse on truth is not about correctness or so-called empirical facts. Rather, it is about what phenomenally appears in the real world of ontic relations. Both the methods of interpretation and explanation are making propositional assertions about truth claims, and truth claims stand in relation to what they ultimately signify or represent, namely onto-phenomenological conditions. Whether in the humanities or the sciences, a sound theory of discourse must have a source, force, form, object, and goal. Although the source is, strictly speaking, mediated through human cognition, it attempts to answer the question of fundamental ontology. The force or essence of discourse is process, or the revealed organizing principles behind the narrative or method. The form is the organizational style, typology, categorization, formula, patterning, and/or genre of the narrative, often poetical, metaphorical, and brimming with latent meanings, usually revolving around the development of explanatory models within meta-narratives and meta-representations. The object of discourse refers to contents, properties, place, context, contingencies, and projections, although it can be taken as real, literate, material, significatory, and/or suggestive of a greater transcendental object or reality. But to a minor degree, the object of discourse, the overarching narrative or metastructure, is intimately linked with its goal, namely its purpose. The purpose or aim is both to interpret and explain, hence to assign meaning and value to the narrative. The discourse of logos furthermore discloses an intent or telos, even if subtle, hence revealing a purpose or agency behind the story. In conclusion, the purpose of theory or scientific research of discourse itself is to explicate, describe, and interpret the manifold of appearances, what we experience and observe, in order to offer coherent expositions of the world. I see no good in taking sides when it comes to offering models of investigation that illuminate psychoanalytic discourse. This is often based on politically driven motivations and ideologies, always financially informed, conceived through hegemonic identifications with what is true and what is really real, itself a rather myopic attempt at thought control. Given that images or paradigms of knowledge are largely based on the political promulgation of self-interest, we would do better to unify our efforts at unifying knowledge by educating society on the value of psychoanalysis, rather than create divisions within our profession that serve to erode the overall mission of what we collectively hold in commonality as a contribution to humanity. Here, the scholar, practitioner, and researcher share a common ground, the voice and pursuit of logos, the scientific spirit, reason, and laughter, in the hopes that regardless of our differing modes of discourse and methodology, they forge and illuminate two new pathways to knowledge. Thank you.